Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to this episode, and I'm delighted to welcome my guest, Dr Jenny Van Hooff. Jenny, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for inviting me on, Matthew.
Thank you. So I always start by asking people to say a little bit about who they are, what they do, if you don't mind, Jenny.
Yes, of course. I'm a sociologist at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I co-lead our Centre for Contemporary Intimacies, and my research is into contemporary intimacy. So lots of different kinds of forms of personal life, really, couples, dating apps, friendships. I've researched masculinities, sex work, so kind of a broad area, all under the kind of personal life heading.
And how did you get into that sort of field? Because it's a little bit niche, isn't it? How did you go down into that sort of avenue, if you like, Jenny?
I studied sociology at Manchester University, and I was taught by David Morgan, who is one of the most influential sociologists in British sociology, and he taught me a course on intimate relationships, and that's and then helped me get PhD funding after that. So it really is all down to him.
Wow, that's amazing. And because it sort of sounds, if you don't mind me saying, it sort of sounds a little bit more psychological or counselling or something like that route rather than sociological. Is that fair, or have I got that completely wrong?
That's really interesting. Actually, it's one of the things that I'm most interested in is turning like a sociological lens onto these things. So, for example, I did some research on infidelity, and it's hardly been studied at all from a sociological perspective. And I think this is because it's seen as an individual thing, something that's private, something that is like an individual kind of pathology. And I think as sociologists, all these very individual relationships and experiences can tell us a huge amount about how we experience relationships, how we view them more generally. So I think sociology, I'm definitely a sociologist, and I do think sociology can offer a huge amount to the study of intimacy and things you would have previously regarded as private or secret even. I think using our sociological imagination when we're kind of looking at these things can just provide so much insight.
And I've got to see where you kind of got into this, because I wondered how much it links up with sort of like topics of the family or something like that in terms of relationships, the contemporary nuclear family, etc., and how much we've moved away from that. Do you sort of delve into the areas of the family structure and so on as well?
Actually, when I do research things that kind of relationships that are outside of the traditional family, although the couple, I suppose, could be seen as a kind of central unit. I'm really influenced by Carol Smart and her understanding of personal life and relationships, and taking a broader view of family rather than that kind of traditional nuclear family that I was taught about, the Talcott Parsons, and very kind of fixed roles. So focusing less on the structure of family and more on how we kind of define our relationships. So, for example, I research friendship quite a bit, and I think we always have this, what Shelley Budgeon called a hierarchy of intimacy. And it's not just in the way that society views relationships, but also how, as sociologists, we seem to think certain relationships are more worthy of study or more important. And it's nice to kind of challenge that a little bit. So with this hierarchy of intimacy, I think at the moment, the sort of sexual couple tends to be at the top, and all other kind of relationships are seen as pivoting around it. And actually, people today have diverse relationships and friendships, even things like pets and things like that. If we take a much more a broader view and a more inclusive view of personal life. We can see about how all these different kinds of relationships have different meanings, and it's more about the practice, the doing of these relationships, and how they fit in with a structure, for example. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And you just brought up something that I was going to ask you particularly about, and that's to do with change. This idea of relationships, or how our relationships have changed, seems to be really dramatic in the last 10, 15, 20 years. I don't know if that's the advent of the internet. I don't know what it is, but our relationships seem a lot more fluid or short-lived or serial monogamy. Why do you think there has been such a shake-up in that in a relatively short period of time?
I think, first of all, I would question how much of a change there's been. I think sometimes this is overstated, perhaps by some of the sort of individualization theorists like Giddens, who have suggested we had this huge transformation of intimacy, going from one very traditional structure to a much more fluid, pure relationships. And I think we have obviously seen a lot of change, but there's also a lot of continuity. So in relationships, I think like still very heteronormative in society. We still view sort of the sexual couple as the centre of personal life, and so that suggests that actually there's a lot of very kind of normative frameworks that have stayed in place. But there has been a huge change as well. Things like the internet have changed at least the way we kind of communicate with each other. But I would definitely be careful about overstating the extent of this change. I think there are certain things that have changed. For example, I think today's under 25s in the UK are the first generation that they're more likely not to marry than to marry. And that has been a change. But I'm not sure it's because people are rejecting couple or the family. It might be all different kinds of reasons, financial reasons, for example. Austerity has had a huge impact on relationships. And while a lot of people are staying single, a lot of people are not having children, we still see our lives in those very normative kind of frameworks and stories, I think. So there's a lot of different things going on.
Yeah, I read something about, say, the Tinder generation. And although there's a lot more kind of casual relationships, short-lived relationships, friends with benefits, should we say, ultimately, those people are still looking for the stable, traditional relationship at the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Tinder and dating apps are so interesting. And there's a lot of, there was kind of apocalyptic talk when Tinder kind of came on the scene. 2012 it was launched, and it seems to have completely revolutionized relationships. And again, I would question that. I did some research on Tinder. I interviewed heterosexual men that were using it, because we don't have a huge amount of information on men, how they have their relationships. And while there was a lot of casual sex and kind of hooking up that was facilitated by the app, they also still framed their use of Tinder in terms of wanting a relationship and looking for a relationship. And so it's like more than one thing can be happening at once. So, and I think it also makes it more visible. So it seemed like casual sex and hooking up was all that was happening. And in fact, that's not necessarily a new thing. People have always been having casual sex. And I think it just made it more visible and drew attention to it.
And I wondered as well what you mentioned about, say, the under 25s and marriage rates and so on. Is it just a case that actually a lot of things have just been pushed back, that people are just getting married later or having children later rather than it dying out altogether?
I think there's definitely some of that. I think there are statistics that suggest that marriage is less popular, that it is declining in a way that it hasn't been before. But again, we can't. It's almost like cohabitation has replaced that. So we're still seeing very traditional relationships in style. And it might be that the meaning of marriage has changed slightly in kind of a largely secular society. Things have changed, like the age of marriage. I think for both men and women, the average age of marriage is in the 30s now. And so since the 70s, that's changed dramatically. But also, while people might see their future in terms of marriage and a family, the statistics suggest that not everyone will have that. And I think that's really important that we research things like singlehood and the kind of the more diverse ways that we can support each other and visualize our lives, really. What's really interesting to me during lockdown is the language of kind of couples and families and households, and how normative it's been, and how excluded from this anybody who is single or has a more kind of diverse type of relationship will be completely just left out of this discussion.
So can we go into some of your own research then? So you mentioned intimacy is a big part of what you researched. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, Jenny?
I see lots of different kinds of intimacy. So my PhD was on couple relationships and how much relationships had changed with that kind of transformation of intimacy. And I think I found that just really how well the kind of outward way that we present our relationships and the talk about relationships and equality in particular, gender equality in heterosexual relationships, had really, the talk about that changed. Actually, intimacy was kind of underpinned by very normative, heteronormative expectations, experiences. So far from kind of having these very fluid, free relationships, they were much more traditional in the actual structure than you would necessarily expect. And really that was cohabiting. Like when couples start to cohabit, traditional roles seem to become more overwhelming to that relationship. So my research intimacy has really just been like kind of just looking to see how people actually live their lives, really. And again, I recently wrote something about infidelity, and that was really interesting because it's such a hidden kind of intimate relationship, and it's seen as such as, because the couple is really the center of intimate life, I think, the way we view relationships today, that anything that threatens it is seen as really damaging. So what's happened is there's been a massive hardening of attitudes towards infidelity. So people disapprove of it a lot more now than they did, say, 20 years ago. And I think that's really interesting because it suggests that rather than becoming more diverse in our relationships, we're actually kind of entrenched this couple norm. And it really underpins a lot of our relationships. It underpins our friendships as well. So I studied friendship and how when people break up in their couple relationship, when people have a relationship breakdown, how that impacts on their friendships. And it seemed to have a huge impact because all these things are all interlinked, obviously. When people have been in couples, they'd neglected their friendships. And then, of course, when relationships had ended, they'd felt really, they'd have found themselves quite isolated. So it's really recognizing how all these things kind of work together, how there are systems of intimacy, and how this hierarchy of intimacy really places the couple at the center of personal life in a way that's often quite damaging for people within those couples and for people excluded from them as well.
That's really interesting. Almost in a way, you said we've gone more traditional, because something like monogamy or remaining faithful in a relationship, you might associate that with the more kind of conservative right of centre view, but actually it's across the whole political spectrum, isn't it? That people tend to hold on to the belief of monogamy and staying faithful in a relationship.
Yeah, it's really, studying that was really interesting to me. And you can see this in like the NatSal figures, the survey of sexual attitudes and lifestyles, how younger people in particular really disapprove of infidelity and they're really attached to monogamy. And there's been research about this because quite often there's a real mismatch between people's practices and their beliefs and how this matches up, really, because it's like there's never been more opportunity to be unfaithful with the internet, with married dating sites like Ashley Madison. There are statistics about how many people on Tinder are in relationships, but at the same time we disapprove of it more. So there's a lot going on there. I'm not entirely sure of what is happening there, but it's really a lot of different kind of things seem to be coalescing in our attitudes towards infidelity and the way we disapprove of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You might have thought as a society becomes more secular, that it becomes less traditional in terms of its ideas on monogamy, but obviously the statistics suggest otherwise.
Yeah, it seems to be. And it's almost like we've moved from marriage and relationships as being like a practical thing to actually being based on love and being, we put a huge amount of weight in our relationships, I would say. So we expect our partners to be everything to us, a sexual partner, sort of the person that we talk to, the shoulder to cry on, financial partner, co-parent, live with them. And I just think it's possibly too much weight for relationships in many cases.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you that. Is that one of the reasons perhaps why relationships are more likely to break down or divorce rates go up or short-lived relationships? Are we expecting far too much?
I think our expectations of relationships are just insanely high now, definitely, and and in ways that lots of different people fulfill those roles in the past. So there's various things going on there. So you expect everything from someone, and you're probably not going to get it. Then you're more likely to have an affair, possibly, or look for something elsewhere. But at the same time, if you expect all those things from your relationships and your partner strays, then it's going to be even more hurtful because the relationship is so much more important in your life. So yeah, definitely.
And can we approach that subject that a lot of people don't like to talk about? And I spoke to Dr. Alicia Walker on her research about intimate relationships and infidelity, and it's one of the most popular episodes I've recorded, actually. And a lot of people were really kind of shocked by the outcomes, particularly about female cheating as well, actually. So first of all, before we look into what you found, why do you think people are so cautious about studying that as a subject within sociology?
I've just reviewed Alicia's new book, actually,
Oh,
so
right.
we can definitely talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think for a start, it's a really difficult thing to research. I really struggled to find people to talk about it. In fact, it was part of another study that I did that people talked about it in kind of a different context. But it's very hard to research using sociological methods. I think it must be something that's very difficult to get funding for. And I think, again, it's seen as something that's really private, something that is almost beyond the realms of sociological research, that it's something that's private and it's difficult. The other thing is, I think, it's the stigma attached to it. So I think, for sociologists, it's really important that we can look to explore and account for things without actually condoning them or passing any kind of judgment on them.
I was just going to ask you, is one of the difficulties defining what cheating, if you like, or infidelity actually is? Because people have different boundaries, don't they? I was reading a thing the other day about someone saying that they thought it was unacceptable if your partner watched porn, for example. That's cheating. And quite a few other people said, no, that's not cheating, that's fine. So I wondered if there's a difficulty in operationalising what infidelity actually is.
Definitely, I think that's the case. I think that in the context of the internet, that's definitely changed as well. I had a respondent whose partner used porn excessively, and that was a betrayal to her. And then, of course, a lot of and when I talk to students about it, when I teach this with students, a lot of them think that sort of like texting or being in communication with someone else is betrayal or infidelity. Yeah. So I think it's really difficult. And Duncan and Marsden did research on this in the 90s, and they suggested that basically the infidelity just has this huge scale that it can span from like a one-night stand or chatting to somebody to like long, full-blown several-year affairs. So definitely its meaning varies, and with the internet that's changed more.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
And we've just mentioned Alicia Walker's work as well. I just wondered how your work compares to her, or if you've got any comparisons, how it aligns with Alicia's work. I'd ask people to go back and have a listen to that episode as well if they haven't already. But yeah, how does your work compare to hers, Jenny?
So Alicia looked at women and found women were motivated by sex, and then men tend to be more motivated by emotional validation and friendship, which is really interesting. It kind of reverses what we traditionally think about infidelity. I only included research from women, and yeah, my findings are quite different from hers. Although her users were using Ashley Madison, which is that is like quite a deliberate seeking out of an affair. So mine were more it were kind of things that happened at work or things like that. It wasn't, according to them, they hadn't sought them out. So I interviewed women, and what I noticed was that they felt that they had to talk about the affair as being meaningful, or including like framing it around love or uncontrollable passion, because they knew how much disapproval they get, basically. And it's almost like we can forgive an affair if someone's in love, but if it's just for sex, then that is seen as really sort of just really deviant. And I thought that was really interesting, just how they framed it. There is women basically suffer the consequences for infidelity more than men, and that came through in the interviewees, that they were aware that that women who cheat are seen through a much harsher lens, and judged much more harshly. And it's I think worldwide, I think it's the number one cause of divorce and domestic violence. So yeah, I think seeking to understand it is something that can only be a good thing from a sociological perspective.
So what differed? Alicia said, yes, it was often just for sex. So did you find a different reason for why it happened for many females?
It was only a small number of participants, so they were all kind of different, but they tended to, one was open about it being about sex, and the rest of them tended to frame it in terms of emotional attachment. What was quite interesting was that all of the participants said that they would like to have an open relationship. And I think we see loads in the media, in sociology definitely, about polyamory and open relationships. But none of them felt able to have those discussions. And they all said that, if they just having that discussion would undermine their relationship. So I think one of the reasons we're so disapproving of infidelity is because open relationships are now more prominent and they're seen as an alternative. But actually, within the couple, it's very hard to open a relationship. It's very hard to talk about having to become polyamorous. So I think a lot of them struggled with that. What my research showed was that once you're in a couple, monogamy is seen as a sign of commitment, and it's presumed as well. It's not, most people don't have a discussion about becoming monogamous. It's just assumed that once you're serious with somebody that you will be monogamous, and there's not even a discussion, like you said, about definitions about what that actually looks like.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting that that by being in a couple, you're kind of committing to being monogamous without discussing it and what that means.
Yeah, I kind of get that though, because well, I'm just thinking that if you don't want to be monogamous, then be single, or is that just a bit too simple thinking?
No, that's so interesting. And the women, I used to interview women about their attitudes towards it, and that's what a lot of them said. Like, why would you cheat? Don't be in a relationship. And actually, I think, from what my research showed, an affair is an entirely different kind of relationship to either like hooking up or being in a couple. And for a lot of people in them, the secrecy is part of the attraction. Because people who are polyamorous still will cheat and have secret affairs. There's something about that secrecy, the danger of it, that is really thrilling for them, I think. So it's part of the threat, and it's also part of the allure of it, I think.
Well, it's often used, in something like soap operas, or if you watch something like Love Island or something like that. Those are the juicy stories that people get addicted to. So I wonder if there's something psychological, the danger element of it. Is that all part of it?
Possibly. I think it definitely offers something different to a traditional couple relationship. There's and I think that's what's really interesting with Alicia Walker and her subjects. People on Ashley Madison, when that was hacked in 2015, so that they leaked the email addresses of everyone who's using it, the consequences for people were so devastating. There were 2 suicides because of it. And that's one of the things that I'm really interested in about infidelity, that this is something that is so threatening, that is so that if people were found out, it would be so terrible to their lives and have such a huge impact, but they continue to do it. I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well, that is an interesting thing, because I'll be honest, from my point of view, the thought of being cheated on is one of the most painful, most unbearable things I can think of. Why do you think that is? Because I think for many people, if you ask them, some of the worst things that have happened to them outside of losing a loved one or death of a loved one, being cheated on is right at the top of some of the most painful things that could happen to an individual, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is like seen as the ultimate betrayal. And one of the women that I interviewed who wasn't cheating, but she was talking about her partner, and she's discussing about how he had got himself into huge amounts of debt, to the extent that bailiffs turned up at their door and took a load of her possessions. And she said, when she was telling me this story, she said, well, at least he didn't cheat on me. So there's something particular about sexual cheating that is seen as such an ultimate betrayal. And I think it goes back to what we expect from our couple relationships, that this person is everything to us. And the idea they have a secret life, that they're doing something else, some other kind of intimacy, is so threatening. And I completely understand it and get it. But I don't know what the solution is, whether we need to be more pragmatic when it comes to relationships. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I totally agree.
It goes back to what you said about that expectation of expecting our partner to be everything, which is putting ourselves under a huge amount of pressure, isn't it? I mean, Alicia Walker used the idea of outsourcing, that sometimes, sometimes a partner gives you everything apart from one thing. and that's outsourced to someone else. You know, they might be your best friend, they might give you comfort, empathy, support, but they don't give you an orgasm, I think she mentioned. It's about that idea of outsourcing, but is that going back to the main issue, that we are fundamentally expecting far too much for our partner to be everything that we require?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I read that she wrote that. I think that was really interesting. That, and the people that she interviewed as well, they didn't want to get divorced. So mostly married people, and they wanted to stay in their relationships, but they needed this other thing that they couldn't get. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it goes back to that idea of wanting too much. And Esther Perel writes about this as well. She's quite famous writing about relationships, modern relationships, and infidelities. That we just expect so much from relationships, and she says it's more about actually not about the relationship. And I think this is really interesting, that people cheat in good relationships, in relationships where they're really happy and fulfilled by their partner. It's more about the self and about wanting to explore, I don't know, other alternate futures or other aspects of ourselves, or just to be seen differently. So I think there's a lot of that happening as well.
I wonder if there's a wider thing as well, Jenny. I saw something the other day about there's a societal expectation at the moment to be happy and to be positive all the time. And actually, humans aren't supposed to be like that. You know, we do have ups and downs. We have good days, we have bad days. And it's the same with relationships. They're not always going to be 100% perfect. In fact, it wouldn't be a relationship if they were.
Exactly. I think that's really important. And I think we're actually really punitive in our relationships as well, where I can't remember who said it, I think a philosopher, but that if we have these very long relationships, we live for a very long time, and one slip is seen to be the end of a relationship. And instead of taking a broader view where you view a kind of relationship in its entirety and think one slip, but that's amazing if you manage just to have one slip in a lifetime of a relationship. So we're very quick to move on and kind of to leave our partners. That's what Esther Perel writes about, that the instinct is to move on and leave a relationship when someone has an affair or messes up in any other kind of way. And yeah, I think that goes back to our expecting a huge amount from relationships, and that they will be fulfilling in all these kinds of ways. And when you look at research, sociological research on actual lived experience of relationships, people like Jackie Gabb's written about it really beautifully about couples. For most people, it's pretty mundane being in a relationship, and I don't think that's shown in kind of media depictions of relationships or expectations of how they should be. But actually, that it's not that exciting, and that's fine.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah. Could you tell us something else, Jenny? So you talked about intimacy, you talked about commitment, infidelity. What else does your work explore to do with couples?
The first thing I wrote, which gets cited a lot, was about housework, and I think that's really interesting. That someone's seen as a little bit dull, a bit kind of, it's been done really, but it's something that is really important to people, to their kind of everyday reality of being in a relationship. And that's part of the couple thing, that the kind of mundane, boring, everyday things can, and also how far we are from kind of equality in relationships in those terms. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted that, and that women have kind of had to pick up the majority of doing childcare, housework, and these just the kind of way that the jobs are and things like that. It's just expected that that women have to sacrifice their careers or kind of pick up the domestic more. And I think we thought we'd moved on further, that we would have more equality, and it's really rolled back with the pandemic, but also it's highlighted all these kinds of inequalities that still existed.
I wonder, because this is something I'm very much interested in, how couples often naturally, I'm talking about heterosexual couples, often seem to over time naturally start to fall into those traditional roles. I'm even thinking, working in the field of sociology and working with sociology teachers, I'm working with a lot of people who you'd say are very liberal and often feminists, etc., and then later on end up falling into very traditional roles. And I just wondered why that happens. Over a period of time, it does seem to be that people fall into those roles.
I think that's so interesting. And yeah, you're right, heterosexual relationships, they just start to be almost overwhelmed by traditional kind of roles. I think cohabiting is the first. Once people move in together, it's the couples that I researched, they said they tended to fall into these roles. But also, couples were less interested in kind of reimagining them and kind of challenging these inequalities and actually disguising them to me. So there was a way of like justifying them. So, for example, I interviewed a couple, and they were both doctors, both consultants, and the female part, the wife, said to me, "Oh, well, he works much longer hours." And I said, well, he's able to, because you're doing all the childcare and all the housework, and it's those kinds of narratives that still exist, that men are defined in terms of employment and the women in terms of relationships, and it's damaging to both partners, really. It means men can less likely to take parental leave and things like that. So I think it's these structures that just overwhelm us, and I think that's part of just the fact that we live in that patriarchal society still.
Yeah, a male friend of mine, he said that he was, when he looks back, he missed out on his child's first words and his child's first steps and so on. So I asked him why he took on that much more of the breadwinner role. And he said once he had a child, he felt this overwhelming necessity, urge, desire to be a provider, protector. And he was, was that kind of, he was questioning, was it biological? But as soon as he had a child, he just felt this overwhelming thing to want to protect and provide for his wife and his daughter. I just wonder, I know sociologists, we shouldn't really think more biologically, but I wonder if there is something in our evolution and desire to want to do those things.
I think that's really interesting. And I'm sure, I would never dismiss sort of biological urges and things like that, but I think the fact that it manifested in terms of working harder and that's sociological, that's societal, isn't it? That's how, by protecting his child, he had to go and work and be away from them. So there's definitely a social aspect to that, I think.
Yeah Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. So tell us, where can people find out more about your work, read more about your work? I know you're on Twitter as well.
Yes, I'm on Twitter at JennyHVH, and at Manchester Metropolitan University in the Sociology Department. We have a research centre, the Research Centre for Contemporary Intimacies, Genders and Sexualities, so you can find us there as well.
And I think a lot of people would be really intrigued by that avenue of sociology. Maybe they've never even thought or contemplated that before. Maybe if you're thinking about going to university, check out Manchester Met. That might be an area to have a look at for a lot of students as well.
Absolutely, yes. I teach 2 modules on my research interests, so absolutely.
I always think, Jenny, if you're a sociologist, you're naturally quite nosy. So if you can research something about intimacy, sexual practices, commitment, infidelity, I think we're all interested in those sort of areas, aren't we?
I think that's exactly my motivation, to be honest. I'm very nosy.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jenny. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matthew.
Bye now.
Bye.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.